there, my name is Caitlin Gunther, and I'm going to be talking about the physiology of degenerative myelopathy in canines. So before we get into detail about the physiology and how this disease actually impacts the body, I just want to provide a little bit of a background on this disorder. So it is a genetic disorder, and all breeds of dogs are susceptible to this. However, due to the continued breeding of carriers for this disorder, some breeds are more at risk. So just like the ones pictured, the Boxer, Corgi, and German Shepherd are some of the top breeds at risk for this disorder. We see the most cases in these breeds. However, Bernese Mountain Dogs and some others are also very at risk. This genetic disorder is caused by a missense mutation in the superoxide dismutase 1 gene. So by a missense mutation, that means that one of the nucleotides in the gene that codes for this gene is mismatched, and then it codes in turn for an incorrect amino acid, which affects the protein structure and folding, and again, that will cause effects in that protein's function in the body. So this specific gene and mutation affects the nervous system and the muscular system, and unfortunately it is a fatal disease, so most owners do elect to euthanize their animals once the symptoms become pretty significant and begin to really impact their quality of life. So even though it is a genetic disorder, so the animals will carry this gene for their entire life, the first symptoms will typically present between 8 and 9 years old. So the first signs are generally ataxia and abnormal proprioception in the hind legs. So they'll be a little wobbly, off balance when they walk in the hind end, and they aren't really too spatially aware with their hind feet as well. I have a couple pictures on the next slide that'll illustrate this better. You can also notice some overextension or stiffness in the hind legs, which can progress with time. This affects their ability to stand, walk, get around. This disease really does impact their mobility and their ability to walk. The weakness will progress and eventually result in paresis in the hind limbs. And as symptoms progress, the same symptoms in the hind limbs will be present in the thoracic limb. So you'll see the same series of symptoms up front. You can also begin to see dysphagia, so difficulty, abnormal eating, and even their ability to bark is gone once this disease gets super advanced, unfortunately. And like I said, it is a fatal disease, so most owners will euthanize their pet before this disease ultimately kills them itself. And here's some pictures just illustrating some of the symptoms I was talking about on the previous slide. So this first one up here, the top left, that's an example of the abnormal proprioception. So the vet or owner, whoever turned the dog's foot upside down in their rear end, their knuckles are on the ground and the dog isn't aware of that, because normally they would fix it. That's not how they're supposed to stand, but they aren't aware that that is not normal. The top right one over here is another example of abnormal proprioception. The dog is standing with its 2 feet right next to each other, which, just like how we stand with our legs apart to balance ourselves, give us more strength. That's not normal, but the dog isn't correcting that. They aren't aware of where their feet are in the space around them. And then this one on the bottom here, this shows kind of the stiffness and the overextension of the leg I mentioned. So his back legs are super stiff, quote unquote, locked up, and he can't stand, he can't walk very well when his legs are tight like that. And these are all, again, due to that mutation that causes the degenerative myelopathy. So like I said, this disease impacts the nervous system and the muscular system, but most of the abnormalities are happening in the neurons in the nervous system, but the results are seen in the muscular system. So because of that, I'm going to focus on the nervous system physiology for this disease. So this disease focuses on the somatic nervous system, which controls skeletal skeletal muscles and voluntary movements such as walking, running, jumping, all those things that are impacted by animals with this disease. So normally when a neuron sends a signal, the axon potential, or the action potential, once it reaches threshold, will originate at the axon hillock. So right where the axon and the soma kind of meet, right in there is where it'll start. then the axon, the long skinny part, will extend the signal down to the target cell. So in this case, it is a muscle cell. Along the axon is the myelin sheath, which insulates the axon to speed up the action potential and protect the axon from any damage. And then once the signal reaches the end of the axon, that's called the axon terminal, the neurotransmitters are stored in vesicles there, and the signal will allow the voltage-gated calcium channels to open due to that change in voltage, and then the neurotransmitters will be released into the synapse and taken up by the target cell, which will receive the signal from the nervous system. And here's a diagram of a neuron just to illustrate what I was explaining in the last slide to get a better idea of how the signal transduction works. So the axon hillock would be about right here, again, right where the soma, that cell body, and then the axon meet. So this is where the action potential would start. It would go down the axon and into the axon terminal, and then all the voltage-gated calcium channels would open, and the neurotransmitters, specifically acetylcholine for this case, the somatic system and the motor neurons. So the acetylcholine would be released into the synapse, and the target cell, so the muscle cell, would be like right here, super close to it, but not quite touching the neuron. And so that would be taken up, they'd take up that signal, and then the muscle cell would perform its function that it's being told to do. One other thing to note is that these yellow brownish squares along the axon, that is the myelin sheath. Again, that's protecting the axon, helping speed the signal along, protecting it and all that. So in diseased animals with degenerative myelopathy, it's the motor neurons of the somatic nervous system that are impacted. So again, the somatic nervous system, they target the skeletal muscles and control our voluntary movements. And the motor neurons, they transmit signals from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. So they will leave the spinal cord and communicate with the peripheral nervous system outside of that, tell us what to do. So in this case, the motor neurons in the mid to low spine are the ones that are primarily affected, which makes sense because the hind legs are where we see symptoms first, and they are very close to the lower end of the spine. So that makes sense. Some of the why the muscle system, we see the symptoms that we do, is due to the axon degeneration of these neurons. So they just get worn down very easily. And as they get worn down, the signal gets slower and slower, and then eventually doesn't get relayed at all. So the muscle cells aren't getting a signal. They don't know that they should be moving. They don't know that, they should be bending the leg while the animal walks, things like that. Another thing that's happening that in the neurons that affects the animal's ability to walk and mobility is the demyelination of the axons and the peripheral nerves. So the myelin gets kind of worn away. It's exposing that axon, which leads to the degeneration of it since it's not protected anymore. It can also kind of get balloon-like structures, so they kind of blow up a little bit, which is not good, or they could even split off at certain parts, again exposing the axon more, slowing down the signal, not doing what the myelin sheath is supposed to do. And so once this gets bad enough, it can actually trigger the cell to go into apoptosis, so basically when the cell self-destructs, and then that leads to the macrophage-mediated phagocytosis, which is basically the macrophages come and kind of absorb these destroyed cells just to get them out of the way. We don't want dead cells floating in our body, but because those cells are destroyed, they're not there. That's fewer neurons, fewer cells responsible for transmitting these signals to the dog's hind limbs, telling them to move. So none of these are obviously very good. It slows down the signal, damages the neuron, and eventually the signal isn't there at all, which is when the animal becomes paralyzed in their hind end, basically. So just some conclusions. Degenerative myelopathy is a progressive fatal disease. You can kind of treat with medications at the beginning They don't help completely, but they help keep the animal more comfortable. You can continue to give them palliative care at home, but there is no cure to it. They will eventually pass away from this disease. That's why it's very important, especially for any dog breeders, to be just cautious of this genetic mutation. Even if the animal isn't showing symptoms, they could still be a carrier, but symptoms typically aren't seen till the animal's 8 or 9 anyway, which I could have already had several litters by then. The abnormalities are seen in the neurons. Again, the axon degeneration, the myelin sheath degeneration, which delays the signal transduction. And it's those abnormalities and effects that are resulting in our musculoskeletal symptoms, and really impacts the animal's mobility. There's a lot of nervous system diseases out there, so the only true way to test if the animal has degenerative myelopathy is after they pass away during a necropsy, to look at their spinal cord and observe those motor neurons and nerves in the peripheral nervous system being impacted, looking for specific degeneration in those areas. But unfortunately, again, it is a genetic disease and there is no cure, and we're continuing to learn more about it to help our furry friends in the future. And here's just my literature cited, all my sources I referenced for this presentation, and thank you for listening.